Turn with me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. We've been doing this series that I've titled Preparing Saints to Live Saintly. How many of y'all have figured out so far in your Christian life that living saintly is not always easy? Have you figured out that sometimes it's even hard? I mean, sometimes it's just a hard road to go. Someone once said that tough times never last, but tough people do. And some of us are thinking, well, I don't know, I think the tough times last for a pretty good long time, but tough people last. And so the tough people in this case are the people of God who have resolute faith to overcome the tough times. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at living out our faith in trying times, tough times. Don and I were talking about on the way to church this morning. You know, we have trying times in different areas of life. You know, we all lose loved ones. We all have, some sicknesses that come and go and different things. But what Paul is going to focus on today is trying times that we endure or face because of our faith. And so far, in this great nation, we're celebrating our 249th birthday next week, and so far, we've been very fortunate that we've not had to endure trying times because of our faith. Now, some have to some degrees. I know, in the last 4 years or so, there was people who were jailed for simply praying in front of an abortion clinic, and for caring enough to go to school board meetings to make sure their children were being handled right, and all kind of things like that. So there has been persecution, and a lot of times it is because of our faith. But we haven't seen anything yet compared to what some other nations have, and my fear is that somewhere along the way it's going to come here too. And so we need to know how to handle that when it comes, whether it be a very personal way or a national way. And so Paul's going to speak to that today. He's going to speak to the afflictions that we endure as the people of faith sometimes. So the question then for each one of us as individuals this morning is, are we tough enough in our faith to be able to withstand the adversities and the challenges that are likely to come our way as Christ followers? I assume you've heard of the term preppers. Everybody heard that term, preppers? It refers to a large number of people throughout the world today who live in a constant expectation of some kind of extremely difficult times that may be just around the corner. Some people have built bunkers on their property. Some have stored up food and water. Some have stored up weapons. Some have moved off the power grid, and some have done all of the above, or at least some of those things. I grew up in a church. We lived right across the road from the church, and one of my dad's responsibilities was in those areas. We have them here. The areas look like a little closet underneath the steps that go up to the second floor. We had that packed with food and water and all of that back during the Cold War years. I don't know if y'all did that here, but our church served as a place where people would go if something bad ever happened. And one of my dad's jobs was to rotate that food every so often. And they always lived in a constant, readiness for something, for some kind of nuclear attack or something like that. And so I don't think they do that anymore there at the church, but they did during those days when all that was going on. There was a lot of threats and so forth. So, but preppers, they do these things in order to be prepared. When and if extremely difficult times come, things like utility disruptions that some think could come. Food shortages, even a physical attack by a hostile nation. They're known as preppers because they have gone to great lengths to prepare for an unusual level of adversity. As I prepared this message, I began to think about preppers, but not so much in the physical sense that I've just described, but in the spiritual sense. Because that's what the Apostle Paul seems to be calling for in chapter 3 of this first letter to the Thessalonians. That is, these new saints, he's calling for them to become preppers, spiritually speaking, faith preppers, positioning themselves to be able to go the distance in their faith, even in extremely adverse conditions and circumstances. One thing we're going to become aware of today is that adversity is not incidental. Rather, adversity is divinely appointed by God. Now, that's a hard pill for us to swallow. I know most of us pray to God, probably on a regular basis, to spare us from adversity. But in some cases, it's actually God who appoints us to adversity. Now, aren't y'all glad y'all came today to hear this message? Well, let's get right into it and you'll see what I mean. I've titled the message today, Destined for Affliction, and you'll see why as we get into it. Now, remember where we left off in chapter 2. Paul was writing there in chapter 2, verse 18, about his longing to return to Thessalonica so he could see these saints that he had led to Christ, planted a church there, so he could see them face to face. But remember, he told us he had been hindered for a short while. And so now we pick up, knowing that background, we pick up in chapter 3, verse 1. He says, therefore, in other words, he's picking up right where he left off. There's no chapter breaks, no verse breaks in the original scripture, so we kind of put those in there. But therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone. So he's carrying on from chapter 2, that conversation there. And he says, when we could endure it no longer. Endure what? Endure the adversity? Is that what he's talking about? No, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about having to endure this personal sense of wondering how the Thessalonian saints were doing in their new faith walk. He couldn't know this at this point, but he was wondering. And how do we know that? Because Paul sends Timothy back to find out. We read that in the first part of verse 2. And so we sent Timothy, our brother and fellow worker in the gospel of Christ. Paul sends, he didn't send, I want you to know something, he didn't send Silas. Probably Silas was a man of some maturity in the faith. That's a nice word of saying age in the faith. Probably been in the faith for a while. But by the fact that it says that Paul would be left there in Athens alone, Silas had obviously been sent on some other short-term mission that's not spoken of here. So Paul sends the only one that's left with him, Timothy. He sends Timothy back to this church. Remember, they had been run out of town because Paul was so adamant about getting the gospel out. But now they've been away for a little while, not long, but a little while, and he sends Timothy back. Now I want you young people here, how many of y'all are in that category? Okay, I want you young people to kind of, listen up here. Timothy was young in the faith. I mean, he's probably in his early 20s at best. In other places, Paul calls him my child in the faith. In another place, he calls him my son in the faith. So he is young. And obviously, Paul has been teaching Timothy on the go, on this missionary journey that they're on. But now Paul sends Timothy on a very important mission, as we'll see shortly, because Paul had great faith in this young man in the faith. Now I want you to notice that Paul calls Timothy here not his son, not his child, but he calls him his brother and God's fellow worker in the gospel. And so Paul is putting his full trust in Timothy's ability to serve in this vital task that he's sending him to do. Again, for you young people, and for the older people too, all of us need to look at this and see it very close. You know what it tells us? It tells us that you don't have to be mature in age to be mature in the faith. Okay? Someone even young can grow mature in the faith at a young age. Now, usually the two go hand in hand, but there are exceptions. And Timothy is obviously one of those exceptions. And here's what I want you to know, young people. You can be too. You can be one of those exceptions if you'll commit yourself to spiritual growth. Obviously, Timothy had done that. He'd traveled with Paul. He's learning as he goes, and he's growing. Now, another example that we might look at here, just from your memory, is Mark. Remember Mark? John Mark? He might be an example of someone who wasn't yet mature beyond his age. Remember the first missionary journey? Mark backed out. He left. For whatever reason, he didn't want to go the distance with Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. You might remember that when it was time to do the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take Mark again, and Paul refused because he had left them the first time. Paul recognized that he wasn't mature yet. So he and Barnabas split over this argument. And Barnabas took Mark and went in one direction, and Paul partnered up with Silas. And so Mark went with Barnabas. Now Mark would later become a great asset. He would prove to be very helpful to Paul once he had matured a bit in the faith. But here Paul is showing great confidence in this young man Timothy as he sends him back to Thessalonica. So let's pause here and let me just kind of get you to grasp a timeline that's going on, because if you don't know this, it'll be a little confusing. Remember, I told you that he's writing this letter about a year after they were in Thessalonica. However, in these first 5 verses that we're going to look at today, he's actually recalling what happened when they were only about 3 months or so into this trip. And so they'd only been gone for a short time. He was now in Athens, and he paused there to send Timothy back to Thessalonica, and he did that for a few reasons. So he's writing a year later, but he's writing about something that happened just a few months later. So that's kind of your timeline. The reasons he wanted to send Timothy back, well, number one, we've already seen it right here in the Scripture. He wanted to check on the Christians at Thessalonica to see how they were faring. Now, this wouldn't be unusual for Paul to do this, or for him to be so concerned about them, especially because they were in an affliction-riddled environment. Remember, Paul, he's been fighting through all this affliction the whole time he's been a missionary. I mean, he's either being chased out of a town or chased to another town and chased out of that town as well. And we'll hear later about all the beatings and things that he endures. And of course, they all end up giving their life for this mission. So it's not a time like ours in America today. It's a time that's riddled with affliction, especially if you are living in the faith. And so we look at the rest of verse 2, and he says, he sent him there, his brother and worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you as to your faith. So it's because of the afflictions that Paul knew they were dealing with that Paul sends Timothy back to strengthen them in their faith. The word there, strengthen, simply means to reinforce them. Let me ask you, how many of you have ever traveled across the Golden Gate Bridge? A handful. Let me ask you this. When you did you feel safe? Did you even think about it? I mean, if when you think about how that bridge is built, you've seen it, you know it. If you hadn't even been there, you know all about the Golden Gate Bridge. It's built with cables. It's hanging there on cables. It's a suspension bridge. And it has to be able to carry exceeding amounts of weight. Now here's kind of how the short version, how they build a suspension bridge. First they go out into the water and they build towers. Okay? They go underwater, get a good foundation, build these towers. So far so good. But then they shoot a cable from the shore to the first tower. And then from that tower to the next tower. And on and on and on until they get to the other shore. And now that they have this first tower in place, they will continue to string along additional cables, one after another, until they have created this great big wad of cables. And the cable that started gets thicker and thicker because all these cables will now be strung together, making it extremely strong. And eventually a roadway will be laid on the strength of that foundation. Well, that was not unlike what Timothy is going to be doing in this strengthening mission that he's going to have to these new believers at Thessalonica. They had what Paul believed when he left there was a strand of faith as new believers. But Paul was concerned that in that environment of persecution, a single strand of faith might break. It might not hold up. They might not be able to deal. They might turn back. And so Paul sent Timothy not only just to check on them, but to strengthen them, to add more cables to their faith, so to speak, to reinforce their faith, to make them stronger in order to prepare them to deal with mounting adversarial conditions that they were already living under and that were sure to come. Some translations of the Bible here use the word, instead of strengthening, they use the word to establish them in the faith. Establish carries the idea of shoring up their faith. I've been doing a little fencing in my spare time in the last few months. And in some places, I can just drive a thin metal post into the ground to attach a fence to. And it will be sufficient for what I'm fencing in. But in other cases, I've had to dig post holes through rocks and roots and all of that in order to set the post in cement, to shore them up, to be able to carry the extra weight of a gate that would constantly be moving and hanging on it. And that gate, without shoring up those posts, the weight of that gate would cause a collapse in those lightweight posts had I simply just driven metal posts in the ground. Well, that's the idea here of establishing them in the faith, strengthening them, establishing them, cementing them in their faith so that they would be able to stand firm under all this weight that's going to come, all the pressure that's going to come on their lives, the weight of serious affliction and adversity. Paul goes on to tell us in verse 3, I'm doing this, or I did this for y'all, so that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions. For you yourself know that we have been destined for this. You see, Paul's ultimate hope was that no one would be disturbed. Some translations here say moved. Paul says, I'm hoping that none of you are being moved by these afflictions. In other words, moved in the opposite direction and moving back or so forth. I want you to notice that Paul doesn't even name the afflictions. He simply says these afflictions. And he didn't need to name them because they all knew what they were as they were living in them right then. Also, if Paul had named the afflictions, we might say, well, I'm not dealing with that. I'm not dealing with that. I'm not dealing with that. This must not be written to me. So Paul doesn't name the afflictions because it is written for us as well. Whatever afflictions might come in our lives. And so, Paul just says these afflictions. And because of that, Paul could say, and you know we've been destined for this. Paul's saying we have been destined for afflictions. That's what I titled our message today. And more on that in a moment. We'll come back and look at it a little closer. But look at verse 4. For indeed, when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction. And so it came to pass, as you know. You see, Paul had warned them that this was going to be the case as new Christians. We talked about that some last week. About how, we don't lead somebody to Christ and say, man, you're going to be coasting from here on out. No, we don't do that, do we? Because we know the struggles that's going to come. And then verse 5 says, for this reason, when I could endure it no longer, I also sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you and our labor would be in vain. So this goes back to verse 1. What Paul was having a hard time enduring was just not knowing how their faith was holding up in the face of temptation. What kind of temptation? The temptation to abandon the faith due to persecution. And again, like we talked about last week, you lead someone to Christ, you need to let them know that here's the first thing that's going to happen. The enemy is going to declare war against you as a new believer. We call that spiritual warfare, and it's a very real part of the Christian experience. Can I get a whole bunch of amens? You know what I'm talking about. You know why that is? Because the enemy doesn't surrender a soul easily. He doesn't give it up very easily. He wants to get them to turn away from their faith, and Paul knew that, and he was concerned for these young saints. He knew that they had begun well, but Paul was concerned as to how well they're weathering these storms of afflictions that were already present. And here's what we've got to understand, is that abandoning the faith was fairly common in the early days of Christianity. And that was often due to the rampant persecution that came with it. Again, we've never dealt with that. Most of you, like me, have probably grown up in the church. You've seen people come to the faith. You've come to the faith. We get baptized. We begin to serve in the church. We do this, we do that. And it's as far as being persecuted for faith, it's just not that big a deal. Sometimes for a few, but for the most part, it's not that big a deal, and God blessed America. Not yet, anyway. But that wasn't the way it was there. And we talked about, a couple of weeks ago, the marketplace of religion, where all these religions were trying to sell their religion, and they were all in competition, so there's a lot of fighting going on between religions, and then all the other persecution that comes from the enemy. And so, a lot of it going on. Paul speaks to it later when he talks to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 1. Look in your bulletin and we'll read this. This is what he tells Timothy later. This command I entrust to you, Timothy, my son, in accordance with the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you fight the good fight. In other words, you don't coast to the end. There's going to be a fight, Timothy, and you need to fight the good fight, keeping faith and a good conscience, watch this, which some have rejected and suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith. And then he names some of them. Among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, who I've handed over to Satan, so that they will be taught not to blaspheme. Okay? So these are some folks that had turned from the faith. And Paul says, it's going to be tempting, Timothy, to do that because it's going to be a fight. You're going to have to be willing to fight for the faith. He goes on in the second letter to Timothy, sometime later, in chapter 4. Here's what we read. Make every effort, this is when Paul was about to die. Make every effort to come to me soon. He was in a prison, he was cold, he needed a coat, he needed the parchments, the scripture, he needed some of that. And you can read about that there, but he says, here's why. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. And so Paul had someone that was right there with him, but he started loving the world more than the faith. And he deserted. Jesus also spoke to this issue of abandoning the faith in new believers that would turn away. In what we know as the parable of the soils. Some people call it the parable of the sower. You know that parable. It's where the sower would come along and he would spread seeds of the gospel. And some of those seeds in the parable would land beside the road. And some would land on rocky places where there was dirt, but it was also rocky soil. Kind of like where I live, trying to dig post holes in. And I know what that's about. And some of it would land in the thorns, where there were thorns already growing and weeds and so forth. And some of those seeds would land in good soil. And if you know that parable, you know that Jesus gives that parable, then he moves on a little bit, and then he returns to that parable to explain it. And so here's what we have, just a portion of it in our bulletin here in Matthew 13, 18 to 21. Here's what we read. Jesus says, hear then the parable of the sower. And he's already told it, but here's how he explains it. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one whom the seed was sown beside the road. And I always think of, who's that girl in the children's stories that was dropping breadcrumbs? Hansel and Gretel. Yeah, Hansel and Gretel. Remember the birds that come along and snatch them up, right? And kind of messed up the plan. That's kind of what I think about. The beside the roadside, they're laying there, but they're not in the soil good, and the enemy comes along and snatches them up. He goes on to say, the one on whom seed was sown in the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Now that's what Paul had witnessed in the Thessalonians before he left. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. So long before Paul was thinking this way, Jesus was already telling us these kind of things would happen. But then Paul would later write in another letter, the letter to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 15, he would write this, now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which also you stand, by which you are saved. Okay, you're saved by the gospel if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. Look again at verse 5. Paul uses that same phrase here. At the end of verse 5, he said, I was worried that our labor might be in vain, because you might have stepped away. You know, I probably shouldn't tell you this, and my wife will say, then don't. Because usually when you say that, you really shouldn't. But I'm just going to share my heart here. And I listen to a lot of preachers, and I know it's their hearts too. One of the greatest concerns that pastors have is that all that we do to prepare and teach and feed and lead so many times ends up being in vain. People don't get it. You know, you preach messages on from the Bible on change, and people don't change. You know, you preach on giving, and people don't give. And you preach on not living this lifestyle, and people continue to live that lifestyle. And it just goes on and on and on, the myriad of things that pastors will preach on from the Word of God through the years, and to look out and say, I don't think this is connecting. And a lot of pastors are very discouraged because they believe their labors in so many cases have been in vain. And Paul is telling us right here that is very much a great possibility. The Apostle Paul himself planted a church, saw great things happen for 3 weeks. He's about 3 months out now, and his greatest concern is all that we did. The beatings we took, the studying that we did, the work we poured into you, the whole thing. If you turned from your faith, if you didn't get it, if you're not living by it, if it didn't change you, it was all in vain. Maybe we should have went to another city in the time that we spent in Thessalonica. I mean, it's just those kind of things go through a pastor's mind when he pours himself into something and nothing changes. And so it's very real is what I'm trying to get you to see, that this, I can see where Paul was feeling this, and from a distance, he just doesn't know. See, here's what we've got to understand in our day. There was no email in first century Israel, Rome, Europe where he was. There was no phones. Everybody didn't carry a phone in their pocket. I remember when I didn't carry a phone in my pocket. Seems like a long time ago now. You remember when they had phone booths and you had to have quarters? Yeah, remember that? Well, they didn't even have that in his day. They didn't even have a Pony Express. They didn't have Waze. They had to use couriers, and it took a long time to travel from place to place. And so Paul would be out there, and he's sitting at a distance, and he's just wondering. He doesn't know. Because you know what? It's going to be important for Paul. I can see it as a minister. Paul wants to know, did I connect? Because I'm going to go to the next city, and I'm going to do the same thing there. And if it's not been working everywhere I'm at, maybe I need to adjust. Certainly not adjust the gospel. I'm going to do that everywhere I go. But maybe my approach, I don't know. He's got to be wondering. So won't you get to, put yourself in his sandals. He's wondering, is what I'm doing working? Because I'm going to continue doing that, and at least the gospel part, and he's just really wanting to know. Wondering if what he labored to bring to these saints in Thessalonica actually firmly took hold. And so he sends Timothy to get the scoop, so to speak. And he's still going to have to wait. He's going to have to wait for that time for Timothy to travel down there, spend a little time with him, getting the scoop, and doing these other things he's going to ask him to do, and then coming all the way back. So Timothy's going to know the good news a long time before Paul does. And so he's writing in that little timeline I told you that's kind of tucked in these first 5 verses when he hadn't been away for very long at all. And so he's going to send them there to find out about their faith. Also to strengthen and encourage them as they were indeed faithfully enduring. They needed that encouragement. So again, verse 2, Paul did 3 things. Number 1, he sent Timothy back to check on the church. We've looked at that. Number 2, he told him, while you're there, and I want you to stay there and strengthen this new church. And so Timothy did that. And now the third one we hadn't talked about, he sent them there also to encourage this new church. In the Greek, the word encourage means to come alongside. We think of it as to mentor someone or to walk with them in a way that's going to prepare them for the spiritual storms that are still going to come in their lives. So in verse 3 and 4, Paul says, I'm doing this so that you won't be disturbed by these afflictions. So you won't think, you know what, this is something that, nobody expected this. I'm really disturbed about this. Paul's saying, no. I made sure that you would expect this. What I don't know is how you're dealing with it. What is it doing with your faith? As he had warned them it was going to come. So again, in verse 3, Paul says, but we have been destined for affliction. I'm betting pretty sure on this holiday week that we're about to start, and everybody's kind of festive today, I'm betting this is not what you came here today hoping to learn. That we are destined for affliction. But that's what he says right here in this verse. We're destined for this. This is all part of the Christian life. Sometimes when affliction comes, we might tend to think God is punishing us, when quite the opposite is actually true. Sometimes God allows, actually destines us for adversity in order to develop us into stronger saints. Someone has well said, it's on your takeaway there on the first note page today. The symbol of Christianity is the cross, not a feather bed. What's the song? I never promised you a rose garden. Jesus never promised a feather bed. And you know about the cross. The cross is a symbol that reveals hardship, even pain, even great pain. That's what the cross is all about. And so we need to prepare for difficult times as we are destined for affliction. You know, our afflictions might come in the faith areas, but they might come in other areas. Our afflictions might come in the area of health problems. It might come in the area of financial afflictions. It might be in the area of relationship afflictions. Families that are being torn apart. Friendships that are falling apart. All these kind of things. It might come in the way of a loss of a job that's desperately needed, or the death of a loved one, or a divorce, or any number of different circumstances. But even all of those afflictions, though they don't fall under the category of a faith affliction, it all comes back to our faith. It all comes back to how we are depending on God to get us through these afflictions. Look again there at Matthew, on your second note page, the Matthew 13 passage. Look again at the end of it there. It's verse 21. This is where Matthew would say, and when affliction comes or persecution arises. I want you to notice what he didn't say. He didn't say if affliction comes or if persecution comes. He says when it comes. He's saying it's going to come. Jesus doesn't say if it arises, but when it arises. In other words, Jesus is trying to tell us it's going to be a part of life. It's going to especially be a part of the Christian life because we are destined for affliction. You know, affliction, adversity, whatever you want to call it, it's appointed by God before our own good. Listen, you'll never hear the prosperity gospel preachers preaching what I'm preaching right now. You know, they're going to tell you that God owes you a whole bunch of money or He's going to give you all this stuff if you come to faith and everything's going to be wonderful and you'll have jets and buses and planes and all that. That's what they'll tell you. But the message of the Bible, the message of Jesus, the message of Paul, is that we are destined for affliction. The Apostle James wrote about it. It's on the cover of your bulletin, this cover verse. Look there. Here's what James wrote about it. This is really going to kind of shock you. James says, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. James says, when this stuff comes, just you ought to count it joy, because you're going to come out on the other end of this thing so much better, so much stronger, so much better able to handle the next affliction that comes. That it's actually something to take a little joy in. But I want you to notice again, James, like Jesus, he didn't say if you encounter trials, but when you encounter them. Why did he say that? Why are these trials coming? They're coming for our own good. You see, adversity will either make us or break us. Paul knew that. Adversity will either make us better or it'll make us bitter. Paul knew that. And it's all depending on how we prepare and how prepared we are for adversity when it comes, for difficult times. You see, God wants to use the tough times to build up our courage. Satan wants to use those same tough times to cause us to be discouraged. Someone has said, Satan tempts us to get the worst out of us. And God tests us to get the best out of us. So affliction is perhaps the fastest route to spiritual growth. When we endure and when we conquer and we move forward, we grow spiritually. So I'll just close by saying, so whether tough times or easy times, whether good times or bad times, whether severe persecution or relatively smooth sailing, our calling as young saints and older saints, new Christians and those who have been in the faith for a while, it's all the same. Our calling is to live each and every day for Jesus and let Him take care of the circumstances. And in the process, if we hang tight with Him, not just the kind of faith that brings us to Him, but the kind of faith that helps us live in Him, we'll grow spiritually. Let me just ask you a question just to leave you thinking this morning. How's your faith? You know, we look at faith, we think, you mean my faith in Jesus? Yep, your faith in Jesus. How's your faith in Jesus? That's how we became Christians, right? That's how we came into this relationship. We had faith in Jesus. Okay, how's your faith in Jesus when affliction comes? Are you still saying, I'm not going to worry about it. I know it's going to hurt. I know it's going to be difficult. I don't know how long it'll be. But it's the same faith in Jesus that got me into Jesus that's going to get me through this problem. See, it's easier in a lot of ways to just have faith in Jesus for our salvation. The hard part is to continue to have faith in God, have faith in Jesus when we're being showered with adversity. That's when the real question of faith steps up and says, how you doing? That's what Paul wanted to know. How are y'all doing? Because I want you to grow and be strengthened. Be prepared. Because even if you get through the affliction you have right now, there's probably going to be more to come because we're destined for affliction. So how's your faith this morning? Our faith grows when we just live for Jesus. Because moment by moment, day by day, He takes care of it. And we're able to look back and say, He was there the last time. He'll be there this time too. That's living for Jesus. And so Brandon's going to come and he's going to lead us in that hymn, Living for Jesus. And so I just want you to think this morning, are you doing that? I mean, are you really doing that? Is, you know, the kind of faith that you had when you got into this relationship, is that the kind of faith that you have that He's going to get you through the tough times, living for Jesus? Would you stand? Brandon, would you come? Okay. Amen. All right. I'm going to pray, and I'm going to go ahead and bless the food. And so when you get back there, you can just dig in and begin to eat and fellowship. I want y'all to notice Mr. Tom is back. Susie's with him. How about that? So good to have them back. He might be hungry, so you might need to rush back there if you can. But we're so glad to have them back, and we're glad to have all of you here today. And so please stay and eat and fellowship with us, and it'll be a special day for all of us. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for Jesus. Thank you that we can know for sure that we don't face anything alone when we are in a salvation relationship with Jesus Christ. That we're His, and He cares about everything that happens to us and for us, even against us. And that He is so faithful, Lord, that you will use even the afflictions to grow us and strengthen us and to make us come out better on the other side. And maybe even to be able to use us to speak into the life of someone else that's dealing with something that we've already come through because of Jesus. So Lord, help us to count it joy that we can be used by you. And Lord, help us to, we pray for this nation that it'll never get to the point where just gathering for church like this becomes illegal. But Lord, it might. But I pray that even if it does, that we won't falter one step. We'll find a way to gather and worship. Because you, Lord, are worthy of our worship. I pray for the food, Lord, that we are about to partake of. For all those who brought it, we thank you. We thank you that we live in a place that's just abundant in food and that we can eat and enjoy, but help us to always be mindful of those who don't have as much as we do. And Lord, just thank you that for the hard work that's going on, for all those who are in the kitchen. We're thankful for them, and we just pray that you'll have us to have a good time in fellowship today. I ask these things, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. Be sure to say thank you to somebody in the kitchen when you go back here today, all right?